O'Neill's art of characterization in this lecture. Expressionistic drama play believed in the depersonalization of the character. Expressionistic drama believed in the depersonalization of character. It was not interested in the individual but in the society. Yet, in its concern for the inner life of the character, it could not ignore the characters. O'Neill, as a dramatist, however, is not so much interested in the externals of his characters as in their memories, experiences, free fantasies, absurdities, and improvisations. That is why most of his characters are broken fragments, figures of alienation or frustration, symbolic figures of split personalities. They carry on a relentless fight against the adverse circumstances and keep up an attitude of defiance. It is in their defiant struggle against these circumstances that they get dignity. His characters suffer from a sense of guilt because the memory of their past misdeeds continues to haunt them forever. Though occasionally O'Neill made his characters his own mouthpieces, the intuitive power of some of these characters is extraordinary, and the more intelligent characters in the later plays run on their intuitions. They can sense things. The names of Larry and Hickey come uppermost to our minds. O'Neill's characters are not only numerous, they strike us by their amazing variety. They include men who try to follow some ideals, men who are frustrated and misguided, men and women who have undergone miseries and sufferings, men who stand for certain human values, sensitive persons, fallen women and prostitutes, and also men belonging to different stations and positions of life. Henry Raleigh has significantly remarked, O'Neill's characters exist on various levels, or rather on a spectrum that has race or culture or civilization or class at one end and pure individuality at the other. Explaining another important characteristic of the characters of O'Neill, Riley has remarked, his characters are, by turns and sometimes simultaneously, monolithic, contradictory, split, fluid, self-contained, and interacting. In depicting the inner conflicts of his characters, O'Neill has displayed remarkable insight into human nature. He was considerably influenced by Freud and Jung, and in his depiction of the biological world of environment, the world of instinct, in short, the world of unconscious, this influence is most clearly evident. O'Neill's tragic heroes are neither kings nor princes, nor great military generals. Aristotle had laid down that the tragic hero must be an exceptional individual so that his fall from his former greatness may arouse the tragic emotions of pity and fear. But O'Neill's tragic heroes all are they just they are all drawn from the humblest ranks of society. They are all ordinary men and women, suffering and downtrodden. Young is a stoker. Brutus Jones is a poor Negro. And the people who frequent Harry Hop's bar are pimps, prostitutes, bankrupts, bartenders, etc. So from this we understand that O'Neill's tragic heroes are ordinary men and women. In Desire Under the Elms, the characters are all rustics living on remote New England farm and leading a primitive animal-like existence. His characters are ineffectual egoists whining for opportunities they are incapable of using. The most virile of them, the sailors, the stalkers in the early sea plays, are mindless creatures clawing and clutching like dying dinosaurs, and those who show some signs of contact with intelligence and impotent. In spite of the difference in their color and physique, Young in the Hairy Ape and Robert Mayo in Beyond the Horizon, and the Negro student Jim Harris in All God's Chillium Got Wings are closely akin, equally inept and empty. The leading characters in such plays as The First Man, Welded, The Great God Brown, The Days Without End, who may be called intellectuals, are embarrassingly puerile, causing us to wonder how they manage to keep out asylums. Man, O'Neill invites us to believe is a puny creature who vainly dreams of high achievements, but is dogged by disaster. Such is the world of O'Neill, and such are the people who inhabit it. They are not heroes in the conventional sense of the term, yet dramas of Sophoclean grandeur are enacted on this cramped and sorry stage, and O'Neill's tragedy is truly an apotheosis of the human spirit. The people, crippled emotionally, if not physically, suffer. The very intensity of their suffering ennobles and exalts them. Both Brutus Jones, Young, Evans, and Abbey are exalted by the very intensity of their respective obsessions and suffering. We feel that there is nothing mean and petty about them. Their grandeur and heroism is truly tragic. It terrifies, but it also soothes and strengthens. He shows man as he really is, in all his nakedness, selfish and mean, and yet such is his art. He gives to this solid human material an exalted, beautiful shape. In his tragedies, we see the transfiguring nobility of tragedy in as near the Greek sense as possible. Now we discuss O'Neill's realism. Romantic and melodramatic plays were popular on the American stage when O'Neill began his career as a dramatist. He was dissatisfied with the romantic tradition, and during his long career as a dramatist, his search for a new language led him into many varied manners of speech: realism, naturalism, expressionism, symbolism, fantasy, and poetry. He began his dramatic career as a realist. Realism or naturalism was a development more familiar on the continent when O'Neill began writing plays. But naturalism was almost unknown on the American stage. The English playwrights Bernard Shaw, Granville Barker, and Galsworthy had dealt with the burning problems of time realistically, and their plays were appreciated for the natural dialogue, natural scene of family life, and real human beings. They depicted reality photographically. O'Neill also strove hard to introduce realism on the American stage, and for doing this, he had to stand against the genteel tradition that abounded in sentimentality. He wrote four one-act plays: Bound East for Cardiff, Long Voyage Home, The Moon of the Caribbean, and In the Zone, which dealt with a realistic picture of sea life. The plays are good theatre, and yet at the same time they mark a break with the popular romantic tradition of theatre into which O'Neill had been born. He wanted to put his plays, things, and people that he had known in his life away from the stage. His incidents are commonplace: a drunken ex gentleman weeping for his lost love, a sailor dying through an accident, another suffering when his shipmates take him for a German spy and read his love letters, another shanghaed when he had been determined to break with the sea and go home to aging mother, and his characters are simply imagined seagoing types. Yet there is a sense of ship's life here, and there is a sharp economy in the handling of the one-act form. The one-act plays of O'Neill have been described as slice of life because they deal with the real issues of the men who live on the seashore and are often adrift in the world. Their delusions, miseries, and obsessions have been described in a realistic manner. In Bound East for Cardiff, Young is lost and he knows it, but there is something more than pathos in the way he looks back over an aimless life, trying to find some kind of sense to it. Young is not exceptionally brave or humble or frightened, is a little of all three. A little man broken by life, a cast aside without knowing where he is or why. But at the end of the play, when the fog clears, there is also the suggestion that with death came an answer which gave meaning to existence. But a quite different note is caught in the voice of Smithy in Moon of the Caribbees. Baffled through, though he may have been, Young did not complain. But throughout the speeches of Smithy, there is a whine of self pity that stands in sharp contrast to the impelling eternal forces shadowed forth in the peace of the sea, the moon, and the mournful primitive chant of the natives. The only actions in which he engages are negative, in rejecting the advances of a native girl or in drowning his memories in alcohol, the most degrading and self defeating gesture of romantic Welshmers. Smithy is in a fog of his own making. The beauty and sadness and power of life are here. If he could see and respond, but it is not too late. In his frustration by life, he has been binded, turned in upon himself, cut off from what is vital and real. He is especially representative of O'Neill's early naturalistic symbolic style with its modern treatment of a New England sea captain's obsessive pride in his ability to hunt whales for their ale, which drives his lonely wife mad. This little play exemplified O'Neill's taste of tragic irony, his characteristic concern and destructive obsessiveness that resembles the hybrid of classical tragedy, and his fascination with the sea as a mystery and seduction, and as a symbol of the malignity of fate. The dramatist's familiarity with the dangers and grim and ghastly situations is evident, and the fact that he has chosen the one-act play shows his sense of art because they would become intolerable if they were protracted beyond the limits of a single sudden act. He seems to be familiar with the sea, and the terrors that attend the tragedy of shipwreck have been described with marked effectiveness. O'Neill's keen sense of the reactions of the characters under the stress of violent emotion is seen clearly in these one-act plays, and the dialogue is almost brutal in its power. O'Neill is a realist in his choice of theme, realistic settings, characters, situations, and dialogues. In O'Neill's realistic drama, first of all, we notice a realism of themes. Earlier dramatists chose those themes that have little relation to the facts of life as experienced by themselves or their audiences. The themes of O'Neill's plays are concerned with the minute observation of men in the ordinary and eternal conflicts of everyday living. He delved deep into the surface apparent to all spectators. He created a realistic picture of life. His play Exorcism exhibits a young man of a substantial and correct family who is so full of contempt for it that he has walked out head high and fallen into gutter. He is down to the dregs of existence when the play begins. Equally revolted by the character of his life and by questioning devils within him, that even a fresh start on a farm out in the west has no appeal to him. So he swallows poison, placidly saying, "That's over," and curls up on his miserable bed. 24 hours lapse, and we find him stretched out under the delighted ministrations of two drunken friends who are bibulously pleased with themselves for having yanked him back from the brink of the grave. We see him slowly reviving, only to find the ugly, inescapable world still closing in around him, with its intolerable medium represented by the two sources, each still telling over and again. His favorite story, the suicide, comes back to find everything wearisomely same, everything except himself. Slowly, he realizes that he is different, that the devils have gone out of him. Slowly, it dawns on him that when a fellow tries hard to kill himself and seems to fail, the effect is quite as though he has succeeded. The person revived is a new person. The life ahead is life in a new world. With a real appetite for the world, you leave him all worked up about that beckoning farm out west. His first full-length play, Beyond the Horizon, is a tragedy exposing the destructive power of the romantic ideal. In the words of Alexander Woolcourt, Beyond the Horizon rehearses the tragedy of a man whose body and mind need the open road and far spaces, but who, by force of wanton circumstance and the bondage of romance that soon burns itself out, is imprisoned within the hill wall boundaries of a few unyielding acres, chained to a task for which he is not fitted, withheld from a task for which he was born. He fails, and his failure distills a poison for all about him. He sinks amid wretched, disheartening poverty into consumption, and the life in him wanes before our eyes, through scene after scene, written with splendid art and a cunning knowledge of that plague with its alternating psychology of hope and depression. At the end, he crawls out of the farmhouse to die in the open road, his last glance straining at the horizon beyond which he had never ventured, his last words pronouncing a message of warning from one who had not lived in harmony with what he has. The accompanying and minor tragedy is that of the brother, a sturdy, generous, earth-bound fellow, born to till those very acres and sure to go wrong if he ever let the clean earth and the work amid things of his own creation. So, in the hardest irony of O'Neill's mood, it is this brother whom the measured tread of fate and his own characters drive him out into the lonely open. The measured tread of fate can be heard among the overtones of this remarkable tragedy. Of course, the fundamental tragedy of the play lies in the fate of the incompetent dreamer forced to battle with the land for a living against every inclination and ability. His disease and death are entirely fortuitous, and indeed they lessen the poignancy of his fate, which would have had more force of fear and pity if the author had left him still engaged in his hopeless and thankless task of keeping on and on in the dreary grind. The hero is much too deliberate in dying, and the last act is further marred by the addition of a scene which is unnecessary and which compels a wait at a time when the tension is seriously impaired by the fall of the curtain. Anna Christie is O'Neill's second realistic play. Life on the New York waterfront of a decade ago and on a coal barge between the metropolis and Boston at the same date forms the subject matter of the play, and its four acts deal with the moral adjustments among an old Swedish sea captain, Chris Christopherson, and his daughter Anna Christie, and a young Irish sailor, Mart Burke. In the straw, the theme is tuberculosis, and its central victim, an 18-year-old girl, Eileen Carmody, on the very threshold of death. Until the illuminating flash that lights up its last act, the play is for most of its length an ironic picture of the regulation, the standardization, almost the capitalization of the white plague. O'Neill exposes the life of its heterogeneous victims in a sanatorium in Connecticut. The basic conviction which flashes finally into a challenge seems to be in what modern science terms to be psychogenetic origin of disease. Dying Eileen Carmody is brought to the belated realization that she may vanquish death because so she must live to save the life of her lover. The decision to live may have come too late in a losing battle against death and disease, but it seems to be O'Neill's great and thrilling point that it does come, and that will this decision his heroine lives intensely, triumphantly, if only for a few days or a few moments. Different is the story of a woman who refused love and marriage because of a very tiny and excusable irregularity in a sailor's life. In the first of the two acts of the play, we come upon the girl and her lover in the sitting room of her parents' home. We sense the fine fiber that runs through her. We learn to illusions which make her, as she says, different from the other girls of the seaport town. Presently comes a rumor of a job played upon her lover while he was in command of a sailing vessel in the South Seas, a job which involved one of those strong, handsome women of the tropics, so much celebrated today in the fact and fiction of the Gauguin revival. It's an episode which leaves the so-called virtue of the man in doubt, but which certainly places his human qualities and his fundamental decency and devotion in a most favorable light. But the girl's different. She sends him off. In the second act, 30 years later, we find the couple still unmarried, the man still devoted to her, but the woman seeking elsewhere some part of the pleasures of youth that are slipping from her. She paints, she dresses in absurdly youthful fashion, she pouts and she makes love openly and shamelessly to an unmitigated rotter who promises to marry her in order to get money from her. The outcome is double tragedy. The old lover hands himself when he learns of her degrading match, and when the woman learns this and finds that the boy has been tricking her, she makes the same end of herself. O'Neill provided realistic settings and detailed stage directions to his realistic themes. The realistic setting can be well appreciated from the stage direction for Act 2, Scene 1 of Beyond the Horizon. The farmhouse sitting room has changed so much in its outward appearance as in its general atmosphere. Little significant detail give evidence of the carelessness of inefficiency of an industry gone to seed. The chairs appear shabby from lack of paint. The table cover is spotted and askew. Holes show in the curtains. A child's doll with one arm gone lies under the table. A hole stands in a corner. A man's coat is flung on the couch in the rear. The desk is cluttered up with odds and ends. A number of books are piled carelessly on the sideboard. The noon enervation of the sultry, scorching day seems to have penetrated indoors, causing even inanimate objects to wear an aspect of despondent exhaustion. The details help us in recognizing the place and also help in advancing the plot. O'Neill's realistic characters were well defined, and the features of their faces and even the intonations of their expressions could be heard and distinguished. The details of O'Neill's characters are clearly marked and they are more than stereotypes. They are memorable characters. They are drawn from his own observation and hence they are lifelike. Let us take an example from Beyond the Horizon. O'Neill has clearly described the chief character, Robert Mayo. He is tall, slender, young man of 23. There is a touch of the poet about him expressed in his high forehead and wide, dark eyes. Writing about the characters in Beyond the Horizon, Edwin Engels says Robert Mayo is an incongruous figure among his own family, much as Smitty among his forecastle companions. There is a touch of the poet about him expressed in his high forehead and wide dark eyes. His features are delicate and refined, leaning to weakness in the mouth and chin. His brother Andrews is an opposite type, husky, sun-bronzed, handsome in a large-featured manly fashion, a son of the soil, intelligent in a shrewd way, but with nothing of the intellectual about him. The father is Andrew, over again in body and face, and Andrew 65 years old with short white beard. The uncle, Dick Scott, is a sea captain, short and stocky with a weather-beaten, jovial face and a white mustache, a typical old salt loud of voice and given to gesture. Only the mother, Kate Mayo, exhibits qualities which distinguish her, as Robert is distinguished, the husband, the brother. But although she shares with Robert a certain refinement of movement and expression, she is a woman of no discernment and can offer him, therefore, only material solicitude, a bounty which Andrew shares equally. Since childhood, Robert has been given to dreaming. An invalid, he used to sit at the window, stare out over the fields to the hills, and somehow, after a long time, forget any pain he was in as he started to dream. By the time O'Neill had an experiment with psychological realism, he realized his own life had been dramatic enough to be transmuted into art. It's almost axiomatic that an artist takes material from his personal experiences every time he creates a piece of art. But in the case of the final plays of O'Neill, things are a little different. By distancing his experiences, he could provide the required amount of objectivity and give them a perspective. He has achieved a dynamic synthesis between the autobiographical and reality. In the next lecture, we discuss O'Neill's symbolism. Thanks a lot for listening. May God bless you. Oh, Madhikara